Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be having a series of conversations with experts, with government officials, and with business leaders about the pandemic and its impact on Canadian business. Many Canadians will have heard of the company Encana. They'll be less familiar with a company named Oventive. But on the 23rd of January this year, Encana transformed itself into Ovintiv, and our guest today is its CEO, Doug Suttles. Doug has been president and CEO of the company since 2013. He's a native of Kansas, but he was raised in Texas, and we're delighted to have you with us here today.
Perrin, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Doug, this is a year of incredible transition for the company. You could have chosen calmer times to look at this sort of a transformation for the company.
Yeah, Perrin, it's but it has been turbulent. In fact, I think it's not just the events, but the frequency, the number, and the pace. I joked with colleagues that we all prepare for a black swan event. I didn't know I had to prepare for a whole flock of them. But our industry started with the challenges of a price war between the Saudis and the Russians, and right after that started, then the impacts of COVID hit, which destroyed demand for our product. And along with that, we had to do what everyone had to do, which is try to make sure we kept our workforce safe, because our business, we can't turn it off. We can't shut the lights off and close the doors. Otherwise, the electricity will go out and the home heat and air conditioning will stop and mobility will end. So we had to find a way to do both of those things, keep people safe and continue to operate.
So for the energy sector, it really was a perfect storm. You had both a collapse in demand, the problems of operating during COVID itself, and you had a price war taking place between Saudi Arabia and Russia, all of that coming at the same time. Tell us how you've managed over the course of the last several months. Yeah,
Perrin, we way back when we started our transformation about 7 years ago, one of the things we did is reset the culture of the company, and we picked what we called 3 differentiating values, and they're 1, agile and driven, and 1 is all about if we don't operate as a team, we can't win. Agile is just that, is that today's world moves fast. The last 4 months have proven that. And driven means outcomes matter. You have to be persistent, you have to be resilient to get there. So what we chose to do is that we were in almost uncharted territory with what was going on with demand, built off the back of what had happened with this price war. So what we chose to do is be very responsive, but not do things like reset strategy. We were in a period of maximum unpredictability. So we chose to say, let's deal with this month by month. Let's see where this thing evolves to, because it's clearly been a bit of a roller coaster as we've gone along. And then one of the things we knew is back to that 1 piece, it takes this entire organization for us to be successful. So we were going to go overboard on communicating. And that's what we did. So we radically reduced our capital spending in the short term. We reduced our activity, put protocols in place to keep our field personnel safe, because they still had to go to work. They couldn't do their job from home. And then what we did is started thinking about where this might go, what scenarios might exist, and what actions we might take. But we were being very cautious. Unfortunately, in my career, I've had a lot of crisis management experience. And I think a couple of things: don't rewrite strategy in a crisis, not a good plan. Be very careful about trying to predict the future when it's unpredictable at its maximum. But lastly, make sure you keep your workforce with you, because without them, you stand no chance.
The issue of the workforce is something that is a particular challenge for you. In many other instances, when I've talked to CEOs, they've been operating in offices, and the vast bulk of their workforce is in offices. They've been surprised by how easy it was to transition to working from home. In your case, many people are literally out in the field. What's the balance within the company? What percentage of your employees were able to work from home, and what ones had to work in the field or had to be at the office during the whole of the pandemic?
Yeah, Perrin, and we like to think of it as the workforce, because on any given day, we'll have 2 to 3 times as many contractors and vendors working at our locations as we have employees. So when we look at employees, it was about a third, but when we look at our workforce, it was more than half. Because we don't treat a contractor any different than an employee in terms of their safety and wellness. When they show up on site, they're a human being just like everyone else is, and we need to make sure we keep them safe. So one of the things we did is we said, well, we talked to the experts and said, what do we need to do to reduce this risk to an acceptable level? Because zero is not possible. And zero is not possible in any of the things we do in life: drive a car, fly in an airplane, or show up for work. And they told us a few things. Make sure sick people don't come to work. So get really rigorous about this. And I think maybe this is one of the positive things that comes out of COVID, because I, like many people, I'm sure I've come to work over the last 37, 38 years, probably with a cold or the flu, because I was committed to work and I probably gave it to someone else. Now we've got to shift that.
That was a sign of diligence before. You were seen as being a good employee if you never took a day off for sickness.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think we've shifted that. So we have every employee, even today, including me, every morning has to answer 19 questions, which are fundamentally about, do you show any symptoms of COVID, or have you been around anyone with COVID? You say yes to any of those questions, you actually can't be at the work site until you speak with our company nurse. We've done temperature checks. We require masks. We do all the cleaning and the social distancing. And actually, in some cases, if it wasn't critical, like a visitor be on site, we actually asked them not to be there. So we more tightly controlled. And actually, 4.5 months in, we don't have a single case of transmission in our workplace.
That's sort of how many employees are we talking about there?
Yeah, it's about, at the time, it was about 2,500, and it was somewhere around 5,000 to 7,000 people a day.
And zero transmission in the workplace?
None, zero. I think to date, we've had 21 employees contract the virus. None of them contracted at work, and none of them spread it at work. So these protocols are working. Now, it's always possible it can, and we've thought through that. We've thought, what happens if we get transmission in one of our work sites? What are we going to do so that we're ready to act? But even though working from home and some of these technologies like you and I are using today are good, they work for the routine tasks, and they work where relationships are well established. But when you get into the more difficult, complex topics, they are subpar. It's very hard to have a dozen people in a challenging, complex discussion and debate over video. And it's particularly difficult if you don't know those individuals already quite well. We had an interesting case of, we had hired a senior manager literally about 2 weeks before all this began. And we were quite worried about how he would get embedded in our organization. He didn't know our people, he didn't know our culture, and you don't pick that up over a video conference. So we found we had to do this. We've now been everyone back at work except high-risk employees since June the 12th in all of our locations, whether it be Calgary or Denver or Houston and the field locations. And that track record of no transmission at work still remains.
You operate across national boundaries, both in the United States and in Canada. Has that posed a problem during the pandemic, or has it moved very smoothly?
Well, I think it's worked pretty well. I think that what we've tried to do is obviously adapt to the best learnings we have, but also the local rules and regulations. And they're different in different places, which creates some complexity, but it's manageable. I think the biggest issue we have today is we can't cross the border because of the quarantine rules in Canada, where we're not doing a lot of travel, but we are doing some. So we're having to find ways to get senior leaders in front of employees, using Canadians to talk to our Canadian employees and U.S. Leaders to talk to our U.S. leaders. And it's required some teamwork from our leaders. A Canadian leader might have U.S. employees that has to lean on one of their colleagues to do some of that communication for them. But I would say we found ways to manage this. The way we're working today, I think we could sustain indefinitely if required.
So in terms of Oventiv's internal management and functioning, it's gone remarkably smoothly, not without challenges, but it's gone smoothly. How have you found in terms of your relationship with suppliers and with customers and with others? Have there been problems posed by the pandemic in that area?
I think that there's been a great deal of collaboration. People are learning and doing different things. I think the biggest challenges we've ran into with suppliers has been around interpreting local rules, where some of the rules have at times not made sense, and they not necessarily having the same sort of relationships to go explore what was really meant, and in some cases even ask for exceptions. That's probably been the only significant challenge. The commitment to the safe workplace, we've seen no variance in that, but we have had to work with a few folks to say, well, look, how do we meet the local requirements but continue to operate the business? And in many cases, that's where a relationship with government's been key to get some clarity, and as I said, in a few cases, even get exceptions to some of their policies.
You were mentioning earlier that one of the things you shouldn't do in a crisis is to make dramatic changes in terms of strategy. How do you see long-term and short-term strategy and decision-making taking place during a situation like this? We're looking at a pandemic that best estimates are we're going to be looking at it for at least the next 2 years. How does this affect your decision-making process?
Well, in our business, because demand for our products has such a huge impact on what we do and the price of our products, we've had to look at a variety of scenarios. Everything from demand stays reduced for a considerable period of time, and even what we're seeing now, this sort of what I'd call a bumpy recovery as we see reemergence of more cases of the virus, and society has to react to that. But we've actually tried to maximize flexibility and realize that we could see a quicker recovery or a slower recovery or an up and down recovery, and we need to have the agility to be able to adapt to any of those. When we looked out, we thought we would take a harder look at the next 6 quarters. Beyond the next 6 quarters, it felt almost impossible. And what we said is clearly demand for oil and gas is going to be lower as economic activity returns, but it's still got some ways to go. And therefore, we would be at a lower level of activity, and we would prioritize things like the balance sheet through the storm. But the other thing we said is, let's focus in on efficiency. It's the one thing we have direct control over. We don't require others to affect our internal. Some of the external efficiencies, governments and others can impact, and we're trying to work on those. But that's how we've done it, and get the organization focused in on that, and realize that longer term, people are going to need the products we produce. The society will not stay locked down. The freedoms, the pleasures that we've all learned to enjoy, we're not going to abandon and deny to our children and our grandchildren. I'm convinced of that. And mankind and society have learned how to manage and live with viruses and diseases in the past, and we will prevail here. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. The timing's the hard part, though, clearly.
You were mentioning earlier some of the lessons in terms of leadership during tough times, one of them being stay very close to your employees and put them in the forefront of your mind. What are some of the other leadership lessons that are applicable to any company trying to manage through a crisis like this?
I think, Perrin, when you study crises, what you find is the characteristics of great leadership don't shift in a crisis, but they really do go into hyperspeed. Your recycle, your learning loops have to be faster, have to be quicker. But the things you need to do about aligning and motivating people, giving clear direction, giving strong feedback, finding ways to stay connected, those characteristics are there. They just happen faster. And in many cases, you don't have the luxury of time to make the assessment in the same way. And that's
or
why
information often as well.
Oh, exactly. There's lots of uncertainty. But what that means is that's where the connectivity needs to really be emphasized. Because of these levels of uncertainty, you need lots of input, you need lots of insight, but you don't have a lot of time. So openness in the culture, the preparedness to make decisions, but be prepared to change them. That if events unfold, and be cautious about, I've read many things about how everything will be different afterwards. I suspect a few things will be different, but most things will be the same. And that'll be the way it is. So I think we've just tried to emphasize communication, connectivity. As a small example, I've historically held a weekly meeting with my leaders. We went to meeting for a while every day. Then we moved to twice a week, which is what we're on now. And the reason is information flow was critical, and we needed to be prepared to make decisions in real time. Even with my board, we typically meet 5 times a year. Through the heart of the crisis, I was meeting weekly with them. And that's just examples of how staying connected, sharing information, and thinking about when you need to take what decisions is so important.
Let's go back to the industry itself. You were mentioning earlier that we were talking about the perfect storm in terms of the impact on the energy sector, but you're mentioning that inevitably, as the economy begins to pick up again and as people resume more of their ordinary lives, demand for energy will increase. Have you a sense as to what sort of pace this will be on? And do you see the structure of the energy sector being the same as it was before? Some people are arguing that this is the time when governments, as a matter of public policy, should be actively moving people away from hydrocarbons and onto renewables. Do you see that happening, or do you see consumption patterns going back to something similar to what we've seen in the past?
You know, Perrin, actually one of the things that surprised us, and I think many, is demand has actually returned quicker than we expected. Now, maybe we should have expected it, because mobility is a part of their life. And people, I think, take it for granted, but when they were locked home for several months, they all of a sudden discovered why they wanted to get out and go see things and do things again. Now they have to figure out how to do that safely in the era of this virus. But longer term, I think politicians need to be incredibly careful here. Energy is one of those things which is required in daily life. And if you have more of it, you have a better life, you live longer, you live better than those who don't have it. We know that. We can study the 2 billion people on Earth who have almost no energy today. The other part about energy is you don't get to choose to use it or not use it. So therefore, it's almost a fixed cost in life. So if policy makes that more expensive, who gets hurt? Not the wealthy, but the poor, the disadvantaged. So policy shift right now needs to be very cautious. Right now, the issue we're facing, the 2 biggest issues are health and economic. And the data clearly shows, and I know you're aware of this, that the people most impacted by this are actually the poorest. So we need to be very careful with saying now's the time to pivot on energy policy and create more expensive energy bills for those people who are just trying to make sure they can get through the next month. Because turning on the lights is not an option for them. And so I think we need to be careful. Plus, science has got a long way to go. We can't scale a lot of these alternatives much faster than they're being scaled today. The infrastructure is not in place, whether that's the infrastructure to distribute those other sources, or actually whether it's the way you use them, like your automobile, or even things like airplanes, which are no one today knows how we'll fly commercial airliners without hydrocarbons. So I think we've got a long way to go, but we need to be careful about creating unnecessary costs for those people who can least afford it.
I want to come back in a minute to public policy, both as it relates directly to the energy sector and more broadly. But just picking up on your point about how demand has come back, what we saw initially with COVID was incredible destruction of demand at the same time as a price war was going on. Now, looking in the, say, the medium term, what do you see happening in terms of prices for the sector?
Yeah, I think over the next, whether it's 2 quarters or 6 quarters, they're going to be relatively modest. They're not, in our belief, probably not going back to where they were before the crisis, because we need demand to return. But markets have worked, supply has come off, investments have dropped. All of the things where a marketplace shows it's working, where supply and demand are rebalancing, and that's largely happened. And so you've seen OPEC Plus took decisions, but you've also seen in the private sector capital investments come off, and even in some cases people have chosen not to produce, to just shut their current production in. Beyond the kind of next 2 to 6 quarters, it's a little harder to forecast. But if investment doesn't return at some point, we could be in a period of higher prices, because in our industry, if you don't invest, you don't generate production and reserves. And if you don't generate production and reserves, you don't have supply. and that causes prices to go up. So I think they'll be relatively modest. That'll be a benefit to the economy because it means people's energy costs are going to be lower. And as we talked about, it's not really an option. But if investment doesn't ultimately return as we pass through next year and head into 2022, we could be in for a period of very high prices.
And looking over the longer term, your feeling is there's a future for the sector and that there will be a need for hydrocarbons as part of the energy equation. Often people say what we're going to need in the future is as much energy, period, as we can get our hands on. We want to do so as responsibly as possible, but we're going to need renewables and non-renewables alike to be able to meet the global demand.
Yeah, Perrin, I mean, I think those of us who live in the West, in places like Canada, the United States, and Europe, believe the rest of the world lives like them. Well, most of the world doesn't live like them. It wants to someday, but it doesn't today. And, you know, there are 2 billion people who live in energy poverty. There's 1 billion people who live without electricity every day. They live shorter lives. They live poorer lives. They have significant health issues. Oddly enough, the parts of the world with some of the biggest environmental challenges are where they don't have energy because it takes energy to solve many of those problems. And we don't have today solutions that are scalable rapidly to displace hydrocarbons. I think when historians look back at this last 100 years or so, they're going to realize the advances in society were largely driven by hydrocarbons. Energy became an afterthought for so many people. So I don't see this shifting for a long time. And if there is a shift, it's going to be technically driven. And I think the smartest people out there today say that wind, solar, and batteries is not a sustainable solution longer term. It will be part of the mix, but it can't replace hydrocarbons in the role they play in society today. So I personally believe governments need to be focusing in on funding technology to find whatever it is that someday replaces hydrocarbons. But the best experts in the world believe we don't have that solution today.
Well, then let's turn to public policy here and let's look first at the sector itself. The allegation is often made that people working in the energy sector are not concerned about climate change. They're deniers. They don't believe that action should be taken. Is that your position, the position of your company?
No, Perrin, and you know, I don't find those people. I find that, you know, we're citizens of the world too. You know, we live here with everyone else, and we have children and grandchildren, and we care about the future. But right now, we know our products are needed. So our industry has been really extremely focused, particularly the last 5 to 10 years, on how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions impact from our operations. And we've made incredible progress. In addition to that, the natural gas boom, which has happened here in North America between Canada and the United States, has been the single biggest lever to reduce GHGs in the world, much bigger than solar and wind, as it's displaced coal, as natural gas has displaced coal. And it did it while reducing people's bills, not increasing their bills, which is the sweet spot we need to find. So I think you'll continue to see this. I mean, all of us, we measure and report our emissions. We're constantly trying to figure out how to drive those down. And as I mentioned earlier, we believe governments should be focused on not only the technologies to find new energy sources in the future, but our customers who use our products, how do they use them more efficiently with less impact? But this trend has been pretty incredible. So I think while we're in this transition, which is undoubtedly going to last decades, our role has to be about reducing the impact in our production process so that we have less GHGs, whether it's methane or CO2 in our production operations. And therefore, we're providing our products at a lower intensity than they've been provided in the past.
So government needs to focus on dealing with COVID. It needs to focus on ensuring affordable energy, and it needs to focus on climate change, but it should not be using COVID as a vehicle for moving the transition from hydrocarbons to renewables. The two should be kept separate.
You know, Perrin, I think there's so many reasons that's the case, including not only the public's trust in government, because I think that that would be very short-sighted to do that and very, if you will, almost opportunistic, but not in a positive way. So I think when I talk to folks today, what they're worried about more than anything else is the economy. They're worried about their health and COVID, and they're worried about the economy. Am I going to have a job? Am I going to be able to provide a home for my family and food? And can I resume the life I was living before, which I want to resume, where I got to go on holiday, vacation occasionally, and see things? So I think that governments need to be very cautious right now. COVID and the economy have to be the priorities right now, because we also know that wealthy societies can do the most good. And if we don't get the economy running again, we won't have a wealthy society. So there will be so many things we can't do. Not just climate; it'll be healthcare and all the social programs which we all think are so important.
That brings me directly to the final question that I had, and that's the post-COVID public policy agenda and what government should be focusing on. I suppose it's perhaps premature to be talking about post-COVID, in that we're going to be living with the disease at least for the next couple of years until we have a widely distributed vaccine. But can we go back to the public policy agenda that we saw in January, or do the governments have to go back to the drawing board and rethink their priorities?
Well, Perrin, I think there was a lot of concerns about the Canadian economy pre-COVID. Growth was slowing down and stagnating. There was a perception that, at least in some parts of the economy in Canada, investment was riskier than investing other places in the world, largely due to some concerns around uncertainty. So I think that we need to be thinking about how do we make sure that Canada competes very effectively around the world for investment, because that will create jobs, it will create government revenues, it will create a wealthy society, which allows us to do these other things. I think that the areas I think they should focus on the most right now are creating better certainty and better efficiency in government. Investors in businesses, one of the things they really put high value on is predictability. There are so many things that are difficult to predict, COVID being a recent example of this, that where we can, we like to see rules and regulations where we know how they'll work, we know what the outcome will be if we meet the requirements. And I think Canada needs to find its way back to that, where it used to be there, it's drifted off, it needs to come back, and then it needs to find ways to actually implement these policies more efficiently. And I think if we do that, Canada clearly has a very talented workforce. It's got immense natural resources. It's got lots of advantages. But if it doesn't do these things, my concern is it'll continue to slip on the rank list of where people want to invest.
So looking specifically at Canada, the government has announced that debt has gone up to $1.2 trillion. That's the floor. There's no plan to bring the books back into balance. It means then that debt will continue to mount. And it's being carried by a private sector that has been seriously damaged by the pandemic and by the global economic slowdown. Do you feel that it's possible for us to return to any element of significant growth in the economy, which would move us ahead of where we were in January anytime soon? Does this require a whole reinvention of the public policy agenda to move to private sector driven growth?
You know, Perrin, I think it's an imperative. I think that the only way to get through this is going to be to get the economy moving and moving faster than it was moving before. Radical cuts to services as a way to fix those budget concerns is going to be deeply problematic. So focusing on efficiency will help, but what we have to do is get the economy moving again. And right now we need to focus in on it because it's obviously starting from a very low base. And the quicker we get it moving, the quicker we find ways, as you've stated, to learn to live with this virus. I think some people believe this might go away with a vaccine around the end of the year. Well, we can't inoculate enough people fast enough for that to work. So we have to find a way until that day where this virus doesn't present the threat it does today, about how do we get the economy moving again? How do we get people's lives more normal, safe but more normal than they were before? And then position Canada to attract differential investment, which will create differential growth.
Well, that brings me to my final question, and that is, looking down the road, are you essentially an optimist about the ability of governments around the world to cope with the challenges that they're seeing here economically and dealing with the pandemic, or do you feel it's something that's simply going to overwhelm their capacity to function? And how do you see the future of your business?
You know, Perrin, I am an optimist on this. I like to study history, and mankind, humankind, has solved lots of very difficult problems, many of them even worse than this one. The other thing we have is we have a lot of countries around the world dealing with this very same crisis. And if we're smart, we're all learning from each other. We're seeing things some people do and finding ones that work and apply them in our backyard. And when they don't work, we realize we don't need to try those things. And I think that learning curve needs to continue to accelerate. I think part of the challenge is the media, who like to promote fear and don't like to promote the successes. That's unfortunate and makes it harder for policymakers and politicians to do their job. But they have to learn from each other. They have to share these experiences. But the goal has to be, we have to learn to live with this. Society has to move on. The economy has to move on. Yet we have to make sure that this does not result. I think the primary objective here is we can't let this be a lot of fatalities. People are going to catch this virus, but what we don't want them to do is have their health significantly impacted or them pass away from this disease. That needs to be where we're focused, and I think we'll get there. I'm actually optimistic we will.
Doug, on that note of optimism, we'll end. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights. It's a challenging time to be in a position of business leadership as you are, but you've obviously brought a vision and a determination to move the company and the sector ahead.
Well, Perrin, thank you. And you guys keep doing the great work you're doing. I think it's your voice with policymakers is absolutely crucial as they try to navigate, which is obviously a very difficult space. So please keep doing what you've been doing.
Will do. Thank you.
Take care.